Hi everybody. Today I chat with Delimarsky, product manager, engineer, reverse engineer of things, and a whole lot more. Well, my goal was to talk to him about all of his really fun side projects around taking the Halo video games and making it easy for you to visualize your game statistics in them. We instead deviated and talked about some other really fun topics instead. We talked about why some products succeed, why do some products fail, what does it mean to have a great product, and what is the role of engineering and product management in building great products, especially when we have AI breathing down our necks and doing some really great work without having to have all the skills that traditionally went into engineering and product management. And we cover a whole lot more as well. So you don't want to miss it. It's a great topic. Pull up a chair, stick around. It's going to be fun. All right, Den, it is great to meet with you online. I believe, I think we chatted about it just before the call that you and I saw medicine in real life, actually, I think on the Microsoft
Yeah,
campus a long time ago, maybe 12 years ago, 13 years ago. After
yeah.
anything beyond 10 is like, just long time ago territory. So I have no idea about it. So it's just great to catch up with you again after all this time. And of course, I've been following your work ever since then as well. So in many ways, I feel like I know you really well, even though through your work, even though I haven't spoken to you directly until right now.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me. And I mean, it goes both ways, by the way. Like Kiruba, like your website, like, folks have not checked out his website yet. Go do that right now. Pause this podcast, go check it out because there's, like if you look for somebody that has both design and engineering chops, like Kiruba's your man. So do that.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about just technical content creation in the
Yeah.
world of AI later on as well, because that's brought up an interesting idea of like, what will the next 20 years of me doing this look like? And you've been
hmm
writing technical content for a long time as well, so I'd be curious to hear like what your future of all of this looks like as well. But before we get to all of that, who are you, and then how do you get started in tech? Which is my favorite question to ask whenever I'm in these conversations.
Yeah, that's gonna be a long, long story. But so
And
I'm
we have
Dan.
time. We have time for
Yeah.
the full long answer.
I like that about podcasts. So we're pushing the bounds. So I'm Dan. I'm a product manager at Microsoft. Before that, I've done a couple of other things. So I've been at a startup. I've worked at another large company that shall remain unnamed. Before that, I was at Microsoft twice, actually. So this is my third time coming back. I boomeranged twice back to the company. So, you explore the things and you realize, like, actually, it wasn't that bad. And you join again, and then you go out and be like, you know what? Maybe Microsoft is a thing. So I'm a Microsoft now. I've been in the security space for the past like close going on 2 years now. So I work in a team that builds the identity SDK. So if you're using any kind of auth in your apps, websites that use Microsoft Entra ID, that's my team. But before that, you asked like how did I start? That I want to say in the most kind of typical cliche fashion for somebody working in tech, that it was like starting from the early childhood, like when I was about like 7 8 years old, something around that. As you said, once you go past a decade back, like it's all a blur. But I think my parents were the ones that kind of instilled in me is like, hey, there's this cool thing called a computer, you should learn how to use it. And luckily, like, we were not a wealthy family by any stretch of the imagination, but in our house we always had, like, growing up, there was a computer, like one of those like old 486 machines that are just like running like what, like Windows 95, I think. Even before that, we had a box that was like Soviet knockoff of an IBM machine that ran like some quasi DOS system that was kind of cool because you could run this. I forget the name of the game, but it was basically this like bartender that has to jump between like different levels and like pick up like beer bottles and then put the empty beer bottle. Like it was just this very fun game. And I remember spending a lot of time on it with these like 5-inch floppy disks that you ask people now what's a floppy disk. That's another podcast for you. But so back then, this was kind of what spurred my interest in technology, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. But what happens if I want to build something for this computer? What if I want to build this game? And that's when I started learning Visual Basic, and that was the gateway to me realizing that I actually want to do this long term, because Visual Basic 6, that was, I think, the first time that I saw, like, I can drag buttons on a form, and like if I program it and I say, if you click this, a message box can pop up and say hello world. It sounds stupid because you're like, yeah, there's like 5 lines of code. For somebody that was like, I don't know, like, say like 7 or 8, that was massive. That was like, wow, like this is just the pinnacle of computing. And so since then, I kind of stuck with it. And, through high school, through college, and not only did I pick up that, but I also got into reverse engineering. Like, to me, my kind of the innate curiosity of just like, well, how the heck does it actually work, is what kind of built on my experience with computers. And I was like, okay, well, how do I take it apart? And the story that I tell people is actually, that's how I got into Microsoft. That's how I got noticed by Microsoft, is that at some point in the past, I reverse engineered the API for the Zune. For people that are younger, they might not know what a Zune was, but back in the day, it was a cool thing for Microsoft that was totally cooler than the iPod, I promise you. And they had this desktop client, this app that ran on Windows that would pull your like stats around, like which artists you're listening to. Like, we're going to get into the whole stats thing, but like, all these kind of metrics that you could pull, and it was like, that's kind of cool, right? Like, but how do I do these? So I learned how to use like Wireshark, and I think at the time Fiddler was a thing by now. And I put together this blog post of like, here's how to do this. And also, I think I stumbled across something that was like, would allow me to download like the movies, like the Blu-ray quality movies through Zune. And I blogged about that as well. And then somebody from Microsoft was like, let's chat about that. And I don't think the blog post is live anymore, but that opened doors for me. So I met the amazing folks that ran at the time Coding for Fun. So Clint Rutgers, Dan Fernandez group. I'm sure you're probably familiar with
Oh
them.
yeah, very much so. Like,
Great friends. Yeah. So they kind of opened those initial doors, and like Brian Peak and all of them. And I kind of got to know the work that they're doing, and they involved me in some of the conversations in the project that they were building. And that's what kind of started my official, like, quote unquote career, if you will. So I started as an engineer, and then down the line I realized that, you know what, but like, look, I like talking to people just like you. I have a podcast and I genuinely enjoy it. And I was like, man, even back then, this was like, I want to say like close to 10 years ago. It was more than that. And I was thinking like, okay, well, like, what is that job where I can combine talking to people and code? And apparently there was a thing called product management that Microsoft called it program management at the time, but regardless. And so I went down that path. I interned as a PM and realized like, yep, that's what I want to do. And here I am, 2024. It's going on a decade, I think more than a decade, of basically being in the field.
that is, really cool. And, let's go back a little bit, Visual Basic. The thing about Visual Basic, right? You said it's only 5 lines of code, but the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that in a world before Visual Basic existed,
Yeah.
drawing the window, drawing the button, getting the event handling, all that stuff working, that was like easily hundreds of lines of
Yeah.
code. And the funny thing is that I think a lot of people today just don't understand how amazing it was to have something where you can go from like I launched a dev tool, I
Yeah.
did something very quickly and got hello world up that it's actually not just like a console message or like just like simple text on a page, but actually was like part of a full windowing system. Like I think that's just one of those things where you've been in the developer space for a long time, so you can probably relate, is that I feel like as an industry, we've just gone backwards in so many areas when it comes to like how easy it is to build web, content. Like, I was in the whole Windows development space, like, Windows, and then like WPF, of course, was huge when I was at Microsoft for a long time. And so I was there, but then I went to the web world and I'm like, wow, the website is so, outdated compared to
Yeah.
how easy we had it on the desktop side. And of course, the Flash world was very, unique in that sense. But it's the web world, but it gave like that flexibility of like a full desktop compositor and all these
Sure.
things without
Yeah.
having to do that work. But that, of course, unceremoniously, like, no longer became relevant very quickly. But I think that's one of the most interesting things is like, you've had to go back in time, right? And I always wonder if Visual Basic did not exist and the barrier for building apps or just even getting started was extremely high. Like imagine a world where you only
Yeah.
had C or C++. would you, or would I, or would others who are currently having a very similar path have gone into the industry and stayed there for as long as we have?
Yeah, that's a great question, mainly because I think I'm a firm believer in removing barriers to entry for folks. Like nothing I hate more than gatekeeping, right? Like there is a lot of these conversations where folks talk about like, well, you're not a real programmer unless you understand these algorithms and can write assembly code. Who cares? Like literally, who cares, right? It's like what like we forget that using computers, it's a tool. It's a tool for something. It's a tool for entertainment. It's a tool for solving problems. When I write code to address a problem. And the problem can be, I say problem in this very broad term of like, it could be my curiosity. Like, I'm curious how this works. And I address that problem by writing code. And I don't believe that there is kind of any inherent kind of benefit to saying like, well, you can only be classified as a programmer if you fit in this like narrow box. And to your questions, like I don't think I would be in the field actually if the barrier to entry was higher. Or maybe I would have gotten in the field, but much later, primarily because think about it, like I was not a super smart 7 or 8 year old. Like I was not one of those like genius kids that is like, yeah, age 4, they can speak 7 languages and write like, assembly code. Like I was not that kid. And if to me, if the barrier to entry is like, well, learn this like cryptic language that has zero like humanness to it, I probably wouldn't have stuck with it, right? And I think it was a massive, massive benefit that computers were accessible. That by then they were, well, I don't want to say like super accessible, but they were more accessible than even a decade prior. Languages were abundant. Like we had BASIC, there was Pascal, which was very easy at the time. Like Turbo Pascal was a thing, even though it did not have like a GUI component, but it had its GUI version, which I believe was Delphi. So there's all these tools that it just so happened to be like the timing was good. And then on the web kind of side of things, you had Front Page from Microsoft that also helped you kind of like the drag and drop things. And I think that definitely accelerated my interest because also that gave you the kind of instant gratification of like, oh, I want to build this app for my school that did like quizzes, right? Like you click a button and like it tells you pick the right or not or the wrong answer. And imagine writing that in the like assembly or C or like with like Win32 like MFC APIs. It's horrible. It is still horrible today. Like even for me now, if you tell me like go write some C++ like Win32 code, like can I do something else? Right? Like I think it's definitely like that paradigm helped tremendously in me picking up the interest and seeing the work. And then after that, of course, as I built my experience, I started diving deeper into a lot of these topics. Like, well, now if I want to do reverse engineering on specific like file formats, I need to learn how C works and how C structs are like laid out in a specific binary file. But that stemmed from that understanding. I was like, but I already knew how some of these things work at a high level, and now I can do a deep dive, right? Like if you think about the analogy of learning how to swim, if I take you by helicopter in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and drop you off and be like, all right, good luck, learn how to swim. Horrible. Like, what are the chances you're going to come to shore? Versus if you start from a more shallow pool and then you're like, okay, now I kind of get the idea and I can be more comfortable and get it to a deeper and deeper level. I think that analogy still stands.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great way of looking at it. It's actually funny because I brought up a swimming analogy in my previous chat with someone else earlier as well. So the different one was still swimming related. So there must be something in like, I think you're in the Pacific Northwest, right? Like,
oh yeah, no,
yeah. So something in the air here. Of course, I'm also here. Like, so there's something in the air here where like swimming,
we
analogies.
like our bodies of water. That's
Yeah,
it.
exactly, exactly. No, I think it's really, an interesting way of looking at it because programming itself is hard, but if you
Mhm.
take many steps back is that yes, we write code, but the people who end up benefiting from that don't really care. They have a
Yeah.
problem they're trying to get solved, and how it gets there and how it works out less interesting for them. And this is a classic model of like, we all drive vehicles. We don't know the internals of like, at least I don't, on
Yeah.
like how every decision was made and why the car was made the way it was and what works there. But there are people out there who do care about it. I'm glad they do care about it and they're very
Right.
passionate about that, just like developers are in this case. But if you take many, many steps back, and this is probably the product manager in both of us speaking, is like if you take many, many steps back, where's the real value add in this? Is there real value add in knowing how to write assembly code, or is there real value add in being able to have something in market quickly that solves
Totally.
the problem very well? Yes, one could make the case that the performance could be, a little bit better if you wrote, assembly, if you were in an unmanaged code stack and things like that. But then it's like, I don't know about that. And what about cross-platform? What about all these other things you kind of get, in many ways? I wouldn't say for free. There's always a cost, but the developer cost might have been a little less. And those are all the tensions that I definitely saw growing up, when working with developers. And of course, at Microsoft, I saw that
Yeah.
all the time when we were doing that shift from like unmanaged to managed, and you had .NET and you had Longhorn, you had, all those various things where like, will managed code be in Windows itself? Will it not be, and all these things? So, we were like right in the middle of all of these conversations. And today it's kind of like the gatekeeping in some ways does it, focus on web development, for example, is someone who uses Framer or Wix or Squarespace or
Yeah.
WordPress to get content out there, would they be considered a developer, or would they not be considered a developer because they didn't actually go and like run some npm command to create the entire scaffolding for an entire app and do everything from like markdown scripts and so on? It's a hard question, and but I agree with you though, like in the grand scheme of things, does it really matter?
I'll tell you this. Like, I have a friend who's an entrepreneur, and he is non-technical. Like, we're talking like he doesn't write JavaScript or HTML, but he's great at executing on the business side. Like, he can kind of figure out the end-to-end story of a business very quickly. And so when I talked to him recently, the same topic was kind of brought up. It's like, well, if you need to build like an e-commerce site, or if you need to build an experience where you have some kind of checkout flow, how do you do this? Right? It's like, you're not technical. He's like, well, you know what? Like, it's true, but also there's a lot of tools that are available today that can kind of piece this thing together for you. Like you mentioned Wix, there's Squarespace, and then Shopify has their own like store and you can customize it. And you know what? He's still successful. It still brings like 5 figures every month. It's ridiculous. And we're like, right, like he solves a problem, he found a problem, and he's addressing it through some SaaS business. And he did not really build the kind of the core kind of components to it. And there's going to be some work that he needs to do to make sure that, oh, I need this like custom flow to get like track like customer orders or something. But there's a lot of stuff that you can basically use like Lego bricks where you can just like put it together and it kind of gets you like 90% of the way where you need to get. And so in this example, he's solving a problem. He's doing the thing. He's actually running a business. He's bringing the money. Does he care that behind the scenes it uses Vue or React or like, I don't know, whatever other framework is famous in this week? I don't know. And
Tailwind.
he doesn't care. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. Exactly right. And there was this moment, or this movement, like, it's like 5, 6 years ago, where it's like, your performance of your content needs to be really, really high, because if it's not, it's going to be, not great for you from an SEO point of view and things like that. As it turns out, that's actually not very true. I don't think,
Yeah.
Google doesn't really, at least from what I've seen publicly, doesn't really care about those kind of things.
It also, it's like we're talking about performance, and it's funny because sometimes people conflate this, especially in the technology space, as to where performance matters and where it doesn't. And I'm not saying that this is like an incentive for you to go and build extremely slow websites, because those are like super frustrating. Like Reddit, I'm looking at you. Your mobile app is freaking horrible. I'm never using it. I'm not like, and their mobile site is even worse because it starts all these like it loads and then it starts spinning. It's like whatever framework they use, can you please not? But like the focus on performance oftentimes takes the developer centric view instead of the customer centric view. Oh, I'm a developer, I want to increase performance. Okay, like you're going to squeeze like zero 0.7 seconds out of some request somewhere. Does it matter for the customers of your marketing site? I don't know, but most likely not. Like, I don't know. Never in my life have I went to a site and be like, wow, this loaded like half a second faster than it could have. That's impressive. No, I went to a site to like place an order or watch a video or whatever. It doesn't matter. A lot of times the customer doesn't care. It's a lot of this developer driven, oh, I need to squeeze every like millisecond out of it. And it depends on the context, right? Like if you're working on something that is a backend service that is a distributed system, yes, every millisecond counts. You want to squeeze as much performance as possible. But for a lot of things like, oh, I'm building a website for my customers to read a blog or something, like, oh, one framework gives you like 0.3% faster load times. Like, does it really matter? I don't think so.
Yeah, and especially true if what you're building is unique, where there's no competition for it. Like for Reddit,
Right.
Reddit can be 10 times slower, but because the things you want to read are on Reddit and nowhere else, we're going to be like, yep, we're going to take a little longer. Same with Amazon, same with some of
Yep.
these other various things. There are cases where if what you're building, of course, it's a commodity. I look at news
Yeah.
sites in many ways as an example where a lot of this republish, the Associated Press or Reuters and things like that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to go to these sites that have fewer ads and fewer things that's like pop-ups
Right.
saying subscribe or do something like that. I'm like, I have my bias towards like, okay, I'm gonna avoid those kind of sites. But those aren't by in large like the most common things that people spend all their
Exactly.
time on. Like my bank website is slow. Am I gonna stop banking now? No, I'm gonna still figure out, okay, let me use a different browser because it's not working in this browser. Like something's like, I'm gonna jump through hoops because there's no alternative. And I think
Right.
that often gets missed as well because as a technologist, you're like, I'm going to spend an entire milestone doing, these kind of things. When the reality is like, if you reduce friction as part of your checkout flow, if you reduce a few of these interstitials, if you autofill things in a more smart way, those are probably going to be much more meaningful than
Yeah.
improving the performance by a certain point.
I,
No,
I
it's
agree.
it's tricky.
Yeah, I agree. And especially, even kind of building on what you just said of like websites that you don't have a choice. Like, oh, you can find a product, but it's only on Amazon. Are you really going to stop using Amazon to order it? Probably not. That's not necessarily, a forcing function for Amazon to say, like, oh, we don't care about the performance. Then, like, your checkout process can take 7 minutes, and who cares? Like, you still want to make sure that it's good. It's a good user experience. To me, like, as a customer, I enjoy when websites are snappy, they're fast, they're responsive. Like these are all the things that matter. I want my bank to be responsive when I initiate like an external transfer or something for that to be responsive, and I don't need to click twice on a button because I didn't realize that it's actually loading already. And then yeah, we like execute the transaction twice. I don't want that, right? But there's a marginal benefit to it, like oh, but if the statement loads, on some marginal improvement faster, do I as a customer care? Probably not. Like there's bigger fish to fry. And to me, again, I've seen this play out multiple times where a lot of times there's kind of this enthusiasm that's very kind of engineering driven. I was like, wouldn't it be cool if we made this more performant? Totally, it would be. But if you have like a list of like 10 other things you can actually improve that your customers would meaningfully benefit from, I'd rather do that.
Yep. And I think I think you touched upon it indirectly right now. I know I worked at different companies and I worked at different teams at Microsoft. All had a very different culture in many
Mm-hmm.
ways. I do think that in situations where engineering drives the large part of the influence or what the product ultimately does, there's a slightly greater emphasis on things like performance and these other metrics.
Yeah.
Whereas I've seen like when either product or design happens to be more influential in these areas, where these sometimes I would take a like a different different prioritization where this is make the user feel more emotionally attached to your product. If it's so,
Right.
maybe this little animation I might add, maybe 0.1 second of extra, file size and time is actually worth it because it's going to be memorable. People are going to like the
Yeah.
brand of it and things like that more. Whereas if you look at it purely from a rational, metrics driven only point of view, you might be in a situation where yeah, we're going to, there might be something huge that is actually a real problem behind why
Mm-hmm.
our app is really slow. But I'm going to block this net new thing you're doing because that's what at least not going to add to the problem more. And so it's easier to say no to something than it is to actually go and refactor something that's actually probably the real core source
Yeah.
of the performance problems. And it's tricky, and I think you and I probably, you say you work at startups and in large companies. I love working at large companies. I love the drama, I love the chaos, I love the, when you learn to survive at a large organization, you realize that those skills are very valuable in only large organizations. It doesn't really translate to other areas quite as effectively. And so I've seen this play out so many times, and it's just one of those things where hopefully you're lucky to be in a place where that level of pragmatism exists. But if it doesn't, it's not the hill I want to die on. So I'm like, sure, fine. You
Yeah.
know what? Yeah, go shave some 10 kilobytes off of this. No one's gonna care. But if it keeps you happy and I have the freedom to continue executing my roadmap, go for it.
I like that framing mainly because I also think that oftentimes we sweat like the small details and we think it's so important. And I like the framing of like, that's not just the hill I want to die on. Like, does it matter? Like, in a year, who's
Yeah.
gonna remember that we shaved off like 10 kilobytes or something? Like, yeah, see, I don't know, not that many people. Who's gonna care about any decisions that we make in like 1 year or 5 years, unless you're working on something like medical equipment where it's like literally life saving. Like,
Yeah.
there's huge, there's a huge liability on you to do the right thing as good as possible. Most of us don't do that. Most of us build like CRUD apps and like SDKs and applications. And it's like, yeah, there's some things that are critically important. And that's why I said like context matters. Like if you work on, like I work in security, and for us, like performance matters. When you deploy some kind of container that does like authorization, authentication logic, every like shaved off whatever second amount is important. If I'd be building an SDK for talking to, I don't know, my roadcaster here on my desk, it's like, I don't care. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, there's always an interesting thing about, especially with PMs who are working on developer facing products. It's a very different world than a consumer product where, like, with
Oh
a
yeah.
consumer product, you want to minimize friction, you want to make it very easy for people of all experience levels and abilities to
Mm-hmm.
be able to use your product very well. Whereas with developer facing product, it's like, well, there's a certain level of technical depth you probably need to have, to be able to be successful in this area anyway. So if there's a little bit of friction, there's a little bit of extra work you need to do to be unblocked,
Yeah.
it's okay. We're willing to sacrifice some of that because, you know, fit and finish and polish may not always be needed. And that's always a tension though. Like, at Microsoft, like different teams, we know we want to say them out loud, but we know some teams really care a lot about developer experience and do a
Mm-hmm.
really good job, like making really polished APIs and like, experiences on the console, on the web and the CLI and all these things. Other teams really, really don't. But at the end of the day though, does it really matter? Because if you need to do something mission critical and there is no alternative and you already bought in on this like overall stack, you're going to do whatever it takes to get it done because
Yep.
again, as a developer, you're flexible. You've seen worse things in the past. You probably wrote assembly, back in the day. So for you, like you just have like a mouse and a keyboard, you can visually do something even if it's like writing in a terminal. That is huge. And I feel like that luxury that all of us who are both product managers in a developer facing space operate in, you know, it's both a curse and a blessing.
100%. All I can say is I agree.
So, but getting back to the Zune, I love the
Yeah.
Zune. Like it's probably I had so many. I had like at least five of them. Every generation of it. Probably the best hardware I've seen, best screen at the time for like being able to navigate. And for me, the best part also was like, every time I'd have like friends over, like a party, I'd actually have my Zune docked to the
Mm-hmm.
television,
Mm-hmm.
and then the actual visuals that it would play, like it'd be like album art, some lyrics, and like the animation behind it. No one else ever did that really well. Even when the Xbox replaced it, for a brief moment where you can play like music on the Xbox and you can have it be streamed, it was never the same fidelity of the visuals. It was like more like this, it's more like what Spotify is today, almost like
Mm-hmm.
15 years later, where it's like, yeah, you see the album art, you might see some colors or something about the artist going on behind the scenes, but it doesn't look as tastefully or as designer
Yeah.
friendly as it was. And also, the Zune was one of the few ones that actually didn't have like a converter from like analog to digital when you were actually project or you were
Mm-hmm.
actually using it. It was an HDMI connection. So it's fully digital. So if you cared about the audio quality, which I'm not sure my ears could ever detect it, but psychologically I was like, wow, I'm
Yeah.
actually like getting the best quality audio that I can because there is no, translation going on between like analog and digital.
For all the crap that sometimes like products like Windows Phone get, and like some of it is justified, Zune was one of the best gadgets that I've ever owned. Like, I'll echo your sentiment. It was just such a polished experience. I felt like, from just like the box that you held in your hand, with like the design of the box and the unboxing, how you kind of get the actual device, and they had like the touchpad that you can kind of navigate, that was not just perfectly round, but there was this kind of rounded rectangle shape.
Squircle.
And yeah, and it was just it was so good. And then you plugged it into your computer, and then the Zune client would fire up, and like I said, like the visuals of like artists and syncing. And it was the first client that actually like it bootstrapped the whole concept of metro design. I don't think they call it metro anymore. I think at some point it got replaced with something else, but it doesn't matter. So that design language is what that was kind of those initial steps, and it was so good. And when they discontinued it, I was like, man, that's extremely disappointing because I love my Zune. It was one of the gadgets that I think I will say the unpopular thing. I liked it more than the iPod. I think the iPod was the first, but the Zune was better. And you know, but I don't want to get on the flame war on this.
I mean, I think at this point, like people have no idea what an iPod even is either. So I think we're in very safe
Yeah,
territory.
it's
Yeah,
true.
because when I was an intern at Microsoft, it's probably like 2007, 2006. The intern gift was I think it was a Toshiba Gigabeat, and it was running the
Mm-hmm.
portable version of Windows Media Center UI almost in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also absolutely beautiful. Like I think Windows Media Center also didn't get enough credit for like how well of a UI it
Yeah.
had for like the 20-foot or 12-foot experience. And that in a portable screen was fantastic. Like I love being able to see
Yeah.
like the, kind of like the rectangular with the glossy and the shadows. I think I was actually watching a video of it just recently because I always like this like to go back and be like, man, we had it so good with some really good UI back then, right?
Yeah.
Even now, it holds up extremely well. Of course, the Zune holds up very well even now because that tastefulness of like a minimalistic design that has like
Yeah.
bold colors and edges, it's timeless in so many ways.
Absolutely.
And I think this goes back to like what you just talked about right now with developer tools and so on. Is like, does it really matter? Did it really
Mhm.
matter that Zune had much better UI, much better packaging at the time, much
It
better, all
doesn't.
these things?
It's not
I think that
here.
Zune was also the first one to have like a monthly pass, right? Like you'd have unlimited songs for a monthly fee.
10 songs that you can download for free every
Yeah,
month. You
that's
can
right.
keep them.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. The Zune Pass had all these things going for it, right?
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, it didn't matter, and I always remember that part because I was like so in the middle of a lot of these things with the Zune team on like how it works on the runtime capabilities and so on, and working in developer division at the time, and I always go back to like it doesn't matter if you build a better product, it doesn't
Yeah.
matter if you do all these things. There are more fundamental forces at play here, and sometimes distribution is critical. Sometimes having the partnership with the big labels so that you get
Yeah.
some of these songs on day one far more important than being able to have like other things. And at that time Zune had really good marketing as well, so you can't even say like Microsoft wasn't investing enough into it and so on. It's like they did all the right things. It's just that, like you mentioned, it was not the first MP3 player by any means. I mean, neither was the iPod. There were many MP3 players that were around at the time, like, but it was definitely the one where it it was not different enough in the areas that mattered, where it caused people to be like, I'm going to switch away from what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch away from the trend of people buying iPods to
Yeah.
try this thing out.
Yeah. I think that there's fundamentally a shared understanding across good product managers is that, for example, being the first is not the most important thing, right? It's like, it's sure you can be the first in certain things, but oftentimes the second product can win. At the same time, and this holds true as well, is oftentimes because you gave up that first place and then you're second, like you said, there's more forces in play now that you need to overcome, which is if I'm a user and I need to switch my, let's say the Zune came how many years after the iPod? Like I can look it up right now. I can Google it, but let's say like 2 years, hypothetically. If it's 2 years after the iPod or 3 years, that means that those 3 years, the customers have already kind of bought into the competitor ecosystem, right? They use iTunes, they bought a bunch of music. And at the time, don't forget, iTunes was DRM'd. So the
That's
music was not
right.
easily transferable. So I couldn't just plug in another MP3 player and just copy my iTunes music on it. Like it was like, oh no, this music plays well on your iPod, but good luck if you want to take it somewhere else. Or I bought movies on iTunes that are also DRM'd that I cannot take anywhere. So those 3 years established that kind of foothold of like all these customers now have this kind of they've invested into this platform to some degree. So you coming in with something else, it has to be massively better for them to abandon all of that. If it's just another one's like, oh, but we also do music. It's like, well, yeah, all right. And it's a totally fair thing, right? It's like there needs to be some kind of benefit of saying like, why would I switch? And yeah, we can argue about the fact that there's kind of new customers and there's existing customers, and maybe they should have pursued a different market. And like, I have not worked with the team. I don't know what their plans were. I don't know what the data they had at the time. But ultimately, what matters is, like you said, like the competition kind of showed that the iPod won. And then, there was the iPod Touch, and then after that they just wrapped it all up. It's like, nope, it's just the iPhone now. But
Yeah, I always think about like, because we both work on products and,
mhm,
even though we don't work exactly on MP3 players, the similar forces exist, that could
yeah,
influence exactly what happens here. And I always have this model where I think of like, I think of like multiple sine waves, kind of going
mhm,
in parallel. I look at three of them at least. One is technology itself.
mhm,
Technology is evolving, and so what you're doing today, it's going to be really cool for a couple of bits, and it's going to become boring. It's going to be like that's like the valley of the sine
yeah,
wave, and the peak
yeah,
is like something really cool is happening. Then there's the whole user preference and user benefit, what users really care about as well. Like, for the most part, there might be a certain need that comes out where a user's like, oh, this is exactly what I need. Then they're gonna be like, okay, I'm bored, I don't need it anymore, so I'm not gonna use it anymore. So there's that
yeah,
little, peak and valley of that goes on as well. Then there's the actual team who's building it
mhm,
themselves. Oftentimes, like, when you look at PMs, you have the founder type of PMs and you have the operator type of PMs as well. And so oftentimes when you're doing something brand new and something really cool, you often have the founder type of PMs who are like willing to be dealing with ambiguity and working on some of these things. And then they eventually move to do something else. And you're left with a different kind of
yeah,
PM who's also equally important on how do you now take this product and make it sustainable and make it go, in the long way. And so what I always felt with the iPod, and kudos to them in some ways, is that they had the technology trend right.
mhm,
And so as the screens became bigger, as the form factors were able to be smaller, as you can do more things with touch, you don't even need to like have like, physical buttons and so on. They
yeah,
kept up with the trend. So they never let the hardware itself languish. And similar to software as well, like all the stuff that kind of played in the color screens came in, and it was really cool. They had
mhm,
the really tiny form factor and the smaller form factor, like of course the larger size ones are almost like iPhone size. They had all that going for them. And they also read the trends effectively, where not only they're first in reading that people want music everywhere they go, and maybe audiobooks and maybe videos as well. And as they got to the point where, like, what, maybe privacy, and not privacy, but the being able to carry your music on any device, listen to any machine without having it be DRM and so on, not a bad idea also. And
mhm,
we can actually reduce some of that. They stayed up to trade on all these kind of trends. So it's a case where, like, the opportunities, most products, most successful products end up going to this period where they're like, they struggle, they go to dark days, and then they
yeah,
eventually emerge at some point. They're lucky, but with, I think in the case of the iPod, they were firing on all cylinders consistently really well. The opportunity never came to a point where, like, that product was at a valley and the Zune came in at a peak where the differences between what made the Zune truly valuable, what made the
yeah,
iPod truly valuable, just didn't quite exist. And I look at that in terms of many apps that I use on a regular basis as well, because
yeah,
my favorite example always is like note-taking apps, right? Like, the
mhm,
note-taking apps I use have evolved, over the past like 15, 16 years. It used to be Notepad on my Windows machine. Like, I use a
mhm,
Notepad file and like many Notepad files of various things I do. And then it went to Evernote for a
mhm.
brief while. Then it went to, like, one of my friends built a note-taking app. I forget what it's called at this point. Wow, I forget what it's called completely. But
Let me
and
ask, who's your friend?
it's Pascal de Silva.
Mm, I
He,
think I
he,
know
he
what you're talking about, but
Yeah, he created a company called Thinko, Thinko. It was probably the most colorful, most visually stunning note app. Again, very simple to take note apps in. Hang on, let me. Okay, now I had to Google this to find out right now. Thinko note taking app,
I'm just
and
really, really curious now because I have
yeah,
never heard of this.
yeah, and
Well,
Pascal's
actually,
been
I
a
think
reg.
I've heard it because the name rings a bell.
Yes, and Pascal's been a regular on my podcast as well, and he's like, he and I work close together on like various design things as well. So, okay, I mean, this might be one thing that we edit out in the final recording because we're both googling this. But hang
Sure.
on, Thinko note taking. It was actually it was also on the Windows Phone. It was a Windows Phone app as well, and so that's why I remember, like, using it quite a bit. Thinko Pascal Note. Okay, I'm seeing. Okay, I think I'm on the right page now. Let me go and see what's the first result. Okay, I think I need to go to archive.org at this point. Wow. Yeah, this is what happens when you've been doing things for like so long that you it's kind of like living long enough where the stadium gets built and torn down and rebuilt again. I think I've been in Seattle now long enough where that might be happening again, with like, I think the Sounders and things like that. Okay, I'm at 2017. Let me see a snapshot of what's going on here. Redirecting. Go for it. Let's see. Okay, 2012 looks about right in some ways. Okay, I'm on the website right now, so I'm on the right page. Lightbox. Okay, Dracula. This is before then.
I mean, you can always find it later. It's no big deal.
That's true. That's true. I'll do one more click. Okay, I'll find it later. We'll talk about
Yeah.
it then, and then this will be edited out as well.
We'll
So
include it in the show notes. It's fine.
yeah,
It's
people will.
post edited. It's
Yes,
great.
yeah. So for whoever's like watching after at this moment, yeah, Den and I probably spent like maybe 3 minutes going to like archive.org and all these things to find it out. But yes, getting back to like what I was saying about note taking apps, always a great example. Like what made me choose it back then,
Hmm.
what made these products really cool, what made them no longer cool. Like did they just keep
Yeah.
adding more and more? Because my goal for note taking is like simple, easy to use. I can access it from various devices that I'm on very quickly. What seems a very fundamental, basic kind of a point. But over time, all these products they had something there. They somehow ruined it for some other reason, and then something else came in, which basically,
Yeah.
5 years later, was basically V1 of the product that I'm replacing from like 5 years ago. Like, look at Notion. I'm like, yeah, Notion, 4 years ago was exactly what Evernote was like, 10 years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
And now I just use Apple Notes right now, and I use Quip every now and then, mostly because of that Salesforce, and Quip was really popular, and
Hmm.
Quip still maintained that very simple kind of a model. Like I can write something, I can share with someone very quickly, no
Yep.
complicated UI, just primarily focused on text. I'm like, this is actually pretty cool. And it has commenting capabilities as well. And so that's what I still use even now. But I know at some point it's going to be like, okay, they're going to add more features because that's what
Yeah.
programs do. Is they add more features to things, and then it gets to the point where like I can't use it anymore. So I'm going to wait for some other company to basically copy what was done by Quip, 7 years ago or 6 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and there's a misconception that every market is a winner take all market. And that's not true. Now, let's be clear. There are winner take all markets. For example, we talked about Windows Phone early on, right? Windows Phone came on the heels of iPhone and Android already being a thing, right? And both iPhone and Android had a bit of a head start in terms of building their app ecosystem. Like, yeah, we all know that like iPhone launched without an app store, and then it came eventually, and it did not have copy paste, which came eventually. But when Windows Phone came on the market, that ecosystem already kind of almost like cemented itself around two key players. And as it did that, a lot of people realized, like, well, hold on, my Windows Phone doesn't have a copy paste, right? They're like, oh, but that's okay. The iPhone didn't launch with it either. Yeah, but you're competing now with an iPhone that has all those things, right? You have an inferior product that you're competing with something that is much better. They failed to pick up traction on the kind of the app ecosystem, right? Like I remember, look, I was a Windows Phone MVP. Like I was pretty deep into the ecosystem, and it sucked that my friends with iPhones be like, "Hey, have you seen this like cool thing that was like Doodle Jump or something like one of those like Flappy Bird and whatever?" And I was like, "Nope, not on the Windows Phone." Like, all right, man. Oh, Snapchat is on the iPhone. Do you want to like send and receive Snapchat, like images? And I was like, I don't have Snapchat on Windows Phone, right? Like that thing, it killed it. I mean, when you don't, because there is a winner take all market there. It's like whoever was the first, and then you invest in the ecosystem, and your ecosystem evolved, and then another product comes in that doesn't quite match up to that ecosystem. Those apps were not there. Those capabilities were not there. No matter how good your camera is, or like how fancy your messaging interface, like it doesn't matter. But also, there's markets that are not winner take all. Like we're thinking about like SaaS businesses, right? Like a lot of SaaS businesses, there is opportunity for everyone. Like you said, note taking. Like how many note taking apps are there? There is OneNote, there is Loop, there is NoteJoy, there is Bear for iOS and Mac. There is like Evernote. I don't know if they still exist or not. I think like didn't they sell out or something? But there's plenty of them, and there is a market for all of them because they all solve their kind of there's Notion, of course, and they all solve their individual kind of market needs. Like I don't want Notion. I want something simple. So I'll just go and use NoteJoy. Or Apple Notes or whatever, like something simple. Doesn't mean that it all needs to be consolidated across one note taking app. A lot of SaaS businesses are the same, and they're not winner take all markets. And that's kind of the misconception of a lot of people. It's like we have to be the only one in the market, like, or not. If you have like 1,000 competitors, that's probably a problem. If you have five competitors, I can totally see another business living there.
I think the bigger risk, in many ways, where this often comes up is if your success is dependent on the attention of some very small, skilled number of individuals. In the case
Mm-hmm.
of phone, it's developers. Are developers skilled enough to basically build for, your platform and the other platform and the other platform? In
Yeah.
which case, in many ways, they're not. They don't have time. I mean, we did Xamarin, there was Cordova, there is React Native, there is Flutter,
Yeah.
there's all these tools that are existing today, but they all have their small quirks and trade-offs where like, yeah, I'm just going to focus all my attention on,
Yeah.
either like, iOS or Android. So Windows Phone was always in this weird spot. And of course,
Yeah.
it had a very different programming model from everything else as well. And it kept changing. Those
Which
didn't
changed
really.
halfway. I was just gonna say, like that was another thing that a developer said, like, what? Like you want me to relearn the thing that I invested just the past 3 years in? Like that was it. Like when that happened, I was like, I'm out. I'm
Yeah,
good.
it was really tough. And then, the WebView apps came in, but, WebView apps were never quite as good or performant or as
Of
nice as
course.
the native apps. So you were like, okay, this is just not a good case. But about note-taking apps in particular, you're right. When having many, many products doesn't cause any, like, I guess I'm gonna call it, like, supply constraints. There's no
Yeah.
shortage of developers, and you don't have to worry about that. In note-taking apps, unless you're building a platform, which Notion does have a platform, but if no one built on Notion's platform, the core product as a note-taking app though is absolutely fantastic. And no one really has ever come to me like, hey, can your note-taking app do A, B, and C? Mine
Yeah.
can. And I've never been like, oh man, I need to go switch to that other
Yeah.
note-taking app.
Exactly.
Never happened, right? Because that just doesn't exist, at least in that world. Maybe it might in the future, who knows? But it definitely hasn't happened before. So in those cases, even if you're a successful product or a company have like 1% or 2% or 5% of the market, that is
Yeah.
absolutely fine. And of course, like you mentioned, like in the SaaS market, having like 5% of, instead of paying customers who use your product and you have 5% of any like large market, that is huge. You don't have to have
Yeah.
10%, even like a 90%. It doesn't matter. Like Salesforce has so many competitors, yet they're still very successful. All their competitors are very successful. Like there's never been a case where like we need to basically have 100% of this area. It's just never going to happen. And that is completely okay because you're not constrained by anything.
And I'd say it's also the scale is different depending on who you ask and who you talk to. That is, if you talk to somebody that's like you, myself, that works at a big company, like there's all these conversations about like OKRs and KPIs, and like we want to drive this up, and kind of 5% of the market might not be enough, right, to sustain a product. But think of like I've been lately very into kind of the SaaS business kind of angle of things, like the indie founder, indie startup stuff. I'm kind of like exploring, like, I was like, I wonder how that works. Like, I've never been an indie founder. Not that I want to quit my job and do an indie founder thing, but like it's an interesting domain that I'm just kind of looking into. And people misunderstand. Like, look, if you have 1,000 customers that pay you $10 a month, that's 10 grand right there a month. That's nothing to sneeze at as an individual, right? Like for a business that like, oh, I charge $10 for somebody to pay me for this like note taking app that is very specialized to some niche, you only need 1,000 people. That there you go. Like you're not cornering any market per se, but you're addressing a niche need, and that's kind of cool, right? Like the scale of like bringing in $10,000 from like a lightweight business, that's great. Like it's not always about the millions of dollars. And I think at larger companies with larger products, of course, when you talk about the capex and opex and all these kind of breakdowns, like you end up with like, okay, well, if we invest so much in R&D and we then do all the distribution and all these things, it compounds to very, 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 very large amounts. And so, like at a big company, you're more constrained in terms of like this needs to be actually, like growing in the market at a certain rate. When you're building something small for yourself, like a lot of like note taking apps, you're not constrained by the same forces, or you don't have the same pull. And then you can be okay with something much smaller that still is kind of smaller in the grand scheme of things, but for an individual, it's freaking huge.
Yeah, I think the indie hacker space is like a really fun one. So much of my Twitter feed is filled with like indie hackers doing really cool things. And what always makes it exciting, which often is missing in large companies, is that almost every indie hacker built something because they're solving a problem for
Yeah.
themselves. They're like, I need a better note taking app, or I need to have a better headshot app for taking better,
Yeah.
photos, and I'm going to use AI a little bit to do some of these things. And I think it's like level SIO is the, I think
Oh,
that,
Peter Levels.
yeah,
Yes.
Peter Levels, right?
Yep.
I mean, I don't know if it's him or if it's someone else, but I think his entire operation is a single PHP file for the backend. It's
Yeah,
like,
I
I
think
think going back to the earlier point, it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter how you build it, as long as the end result is like, I mean, I'm not going to be like, man, I wish this was like, this complicated,
yeah.
serverless solution. Nope, it works and makes him very happy and, very successful in that
I
front.
I listened to a recent podcast where they were interviewing Peter, and by the way, Peter like does a lot of like great stuff. Like I don't necessarily agree with like everything that he says, but he builds, and he's actually like a doer. There's a lot of people that you listen to that are like quasi entrepreneurs, and they all they do is just talk. Peter builds. He actually does the thing, and it is kind of cool that, like you said, like he is very much like, look, I have a PHP file, I rent a VPS, I throw my PHP file in there, and there's some database, and that's it. That's kind of the thing.
Yep.
We tend to overcomplicate things. They're like, oh, but like, what about this Kubernetes cluster and all these like sidecar things that need to like, what are you building, right? Like I years back, I was doing these like Seinfeld clips, and I would just remove the sound and overlay with like Seinfeld in tech. And one of them was the Kubernetes one about like how Kramer wants to do something with Kubernetes, and then Jerry's like, "What are you building?" And it's like, "Oh, some like dumb site." And there's just so much of that in real life where you're like, "Oh, like we need Kubernetes and like an AKS cluster and all this." And it's like, "But what are you building?" Like, "Oh, a blog." Really? Like, like what scale are you preparing that for? Like, why do you need this? Or same the people talk about, it's like, oh, for to get a personal landing page, use like React and all these like components, and then do like, or just open Notepad and drop some HTML that does the exact same job with just vanilla JavaScript, right? And I think a lot of the stuff is we're gonna come to the point where that bites us back. Where it's like that overly complicated stuff that starts breaking unnecessarily. You're like, why am I dealing with this? I need an HTML page. That was actually very frustrating for me. Recently, I was looking at just bootstrapping a website for one of my projects that kind of you saw that I'm working on, like the thing called Open Spartan. And that kind of tails on my kind of fandom for Halo, but it basically is some like homebrew projects for me to track Halo stats. And I was like, look, I want a website for this. I want a landing page and I want some documentation. That's it. That's all I need. I want plain vanilla markdown that I can convert to docs, and I need some plain HTML. And I use Hugo as a static site generator. And I was looking, okay, surely this is like invented. Like there's templates that do this. And literally every template that I would look at, like, we use like React, and then you have to install a bunch of NPM packages. And I'm just like, WTF, man. Like, I'm literally looking at the simplest, like, I want to slap an image in the middle, some text, some links, and then a download button. And then I go to another button, and it takes me to a documentation site that's generated from Markdown. It was insanely hard to find something that is simple. I did land on then like a theme because like, look, I don't want to rewrite a theme from scratch. Like I have better things to do. But like all of it was so overly complicated. Like all of it was just like, oh, download these NPM packages and then go and configure this and that. And it's like, why is this so complicated for something so simple?
Yeah, because I think the number one thing, right, is always like, will people like what I'm creating? Is it like even worth it? Like, what am I doing here? And the quicker you can go from like, I have an idea to I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
validate and see if it works, that's your number one problem, not what your tech stack's going to be,
Exactly.
maybe a single PHP file and things like that. The thing is, in very small teams, or if you're the founder, or if you're an indie hacker, basically, you can try to keep that, focus, always there. You and I both work at very large companies,
Mm-hmm.
and we know that it doesn't always scale that way when you go to a large organization where you have people whose full-time dedicated jobs as it is to like, oh, I'm a database expert. I got hired as a database
Yeah.
expert. So therefore, everything I'm going to do is like make sure we have the best
Yes.
database solution.
Yes.
And I always sit back and go like, I love working on like 0 to 1 products. That's what I spent most of my
Mm-hmm.
career working on. And I'm always like, very keenly, maybe like almost like paranoid about making sure that every person we bring onto the team has a mindset where it's like, okay, the biggest problem we have right now is
Hmm.
what we're building worth it? Will people like it and things like that? It's less about, how do we scale for 1 billion users? And if we can't get
Yeah,
1 user, if we can't get 10 users, can't get 100 users, I don't care about the billion user solution. As long as we have a way where I can go from a solution that has like 10,000 people using it, 1,000 people using it, 100 people using it, can also scale to serving 1 billion eventually without like causing the entire service to be interrupted and having a recovery rewrite. I'm generally okay with like that level
yeah,
of flexibility, and it comes from having both. That's one of the reasons we talked about earlier is like why some of the side projects on the side is that I never lose that that muscle, because it's very easy to be in a large organization and just get comfortable with the idea of like I'm going to move the needle from one part of the table another part of the table, and
yeah,
that to me is success. Whereas the real metric is like, can we reinvent a category? Can we do something completely new? And that
yeah.
requires having this constant questioning of, am I making sure the team is working on making that happen? Or are they now optimizing for things that are not necessarily optimized for right now?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we talk about Peter, and this is kind of one of those things where he does it really well. Is just focus on like I solve a problem, and we'll cross the bridge when we get to it of like billion of users. But like, why design this? When he was writing his book, I think it was called Make. He literally was showing that he was writing inside of VS Code, and he's just like, I'm just going to write it in VS Code or like a Google Doc or something for like a draft and get feedback, and then I'm just going to convert it to a PDF. There you go. There's the book, right? How many people do you know that will try to write a book? It's like, let me find the perfect software for this, and how do I lay out the pages, and let me pick the font for it, and like, how do I like align this? And we're spending so much time like bike shedding instead of actually focusing on what's important. Is like, I want to ship a book. I'm going to write the book and I'm going to deliver it, and I'm going to iterate on it. And over time, if it becomes more popular, like, I don't want to speak for Peter, of course, like he has his own mind on that, but like in my mind, if I'm writing something simple and then I evolve it and I iterate based on feedback, like, oh, now everybody's downloading it, I better go and figure out how to do X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
instead of me spending like 6 months trying to be like, I'm going to make it perfect. And then, yeah, I launch it and nobody's using it.
Yeah, I mean, what you described, and and what Peter does as well, like seems like common sense. Yet I always feel like whenever you are in a large venue or like a large group, you explain this, you're like, wait, what are you talking about? Like, who's going to
Yep.
do A, B, and C, or what about that, or what about this? I'm saying like, why? What planet are you from? Like,
Yep.
if you do this, you're basically just asking for someone like Peter or someone like yourself to just come in and be like, okay, there's a problem here. I'm going to solve it. I'm out the door with it. Whereas like you'd still be like writing a PRD and like getting approvals from all these kind of
Yeah,
things,
exactly.
and that's the part that is always like worrying sometimes when you look at software development and just the complexity of things. And not to mention with AI, with some of the the tools that are available now, what used to be needed to be able to build an app that does all these things,
Yeah.
the barriers being lower and lower. And I think in many other industries and many non-tech areas, if you were to ask me like, okay, you need to go replace like the tire in your car, I'm like, great, I'm gonna go to a shop. I don't care if it's the best shop, it's gonna be in town, they have an availability, they're gonna pick a tire that I'm gonna go to quick reviews, it's gonna be done, that's it. I'm not
Yep.
gonna be like, oh, what kind of tool should I get to like replace it? What if I do it myself? Like, I'm not gonna do any of that stuff, right? So
Hmm.
when you apply the same thing to programming, there's gonna be a lot of people entering this field who are not gonna be in the bike shedding mindset. They have no concept. They don't care about
Yep.
half the things as programmers we worry about. All they're gonna be like, okay, I need an app that does A, B, and C. I'm
Hmm.
gonna tell this thing, an agent or some AI capability that I want to do A, B, and C. It's
Oh,
gonna do it for
100%.
me. And when that
100%.
happens, it's going to create this huge influx of a lot of people whose entire careers are built on bike shedding, and probably very successful careers based on bike shedding. Who are going to be in for a rude awakening where they're going to realize, like, wait, what do you mean ship something? What do you mean actually finish the book? What do you mean actually, take something you
Yeah.
have as an idea and actually get it out the door? And so I see that happening sooner rather than later nowadays.
Oh yeah, and especially because the tools that we get now, like we think we see what I call like AI, because it's not truly like intelligent, right? It's it's autocorrect on steroids, right? Like in a way that how an LLM works, but it's an amazing thing. Like it's freaking fantastic. My use case for that personally is I use it to write SQL queries. Like
Yes.
I hate dealing with SQL primarily because there's just so much kind of flexibility in how you compose and do these joins and stuff. And then especially if you need to join between like 7 tables, it becomes this overly complicated. And I was like, man, I'm going to spend like half a day just writing this query for data that I already have. I go into ChatGPT, unpaid version, by the way, 3.5. And I say, here's the database that I have. Here's the table. Here's the 10, 12 columns that it has. This column has the data structure of this JSON. This column has the data structure of this JSON. Give me a query that, and by the way, there's more than one table. So I'd be like, there's like 2, 3, 4, 5 tables, whatever. Give me a query that extracts me this metric. That's it from these tables above. And I can give it hints and say like, oh, but like use the value of metric ID from this column or this metric. It computes me the entire like this like 3-page SQL query that does the whole like JSON parsing, and it extracts the field into its own column and then joins that. And then I would ask, okay, now this query, can I optimize it? And I literally would just ask it, can I optimize this query? And be like, oh yeah, actually instead of this join, you could use this join. And I'd be like, okay, but like, let me go and actually cross-check, because I'm not a SQL expert necessarily, but I'll go and check. And I'll go and like look up on like Stack Overflow or whatever. And like, okay, yeah, this seems like it would optimize the performance. It makes sense. I saved myself like half a day in at most like 15 minutes of just like, and now I have a working SQL query that extracts me the data. The SQL query is not going to go anywhere in production. It's not mission critical. I don't really care if it's optimized to the millisecond that it could squeeze out of it. I mean, like, did it give me the right data? And then I will go and check, and I will actually like, validate that it doesn't produce junk, because then the query is like, oh, it missed a column and now it's computing the wrong thing. Like, I would still look and see, like, I don't just blindly use it, but it's a freaking amazing tool, because it saves me so much time. And there's this kind of anxiety in our industry right now. It's like, well, is it going to replace developers? Is it? Probably a certain degree of optimization will happen. Like, I think if we think about the entry-level careers, that landscape, I think, will experience some tectonic shifts, because, the people that just, toss out like CRUD apps, it's like, oh, it's like talking to this database, all that stuff can be like automated. If you saw like the developer AI, I think it's called Devin, that they released, it's freaking amazing. Like, sure, we just saw the demos, we did not see it in practice, but it is just like the pace at which we're going is not the pace we will see in 5 years. Like, that's my prediction. I don't predict many things, but I think that's my prediction. Pretty safe bet, by the way. Like, I'm not putting much on the line here, because given the velocity of everything we're seeing, but these optimizations will land us in a position where like a lot of entry level jobs might disappear. Oh, you need like an HTML developer that knows CSS and JavaScript to like spin up your marketing sites, entirely automated, gone. Oh, you need like this entry level like database analyst that's going to run and compose SQL queries, gone. So now you end up in a position where you're like, okay, but now we need to figure out like, what is an entry level job once that actually happens? And, you might need some different level of expertise. You might need to be able to learn more in-depth topics about programming. And we talked about like the barriers to entry at the very beginning. Maybe that will get a little higher, because like you'll actually need to have a certain level of expertise in certain domains that is going to put you above kind of the fold. But at the same time, like, the technology is not slowing down. Like, it's already like, again, like I see it in my job right now. It's like, if my job right now would be like just purely writing SQL queries to extract data, like, I'd be worried.
Yeah, I think you're more of at this point more of a conductor. You may not know how to play your instrument in the orchestra, but you kind of have a good sense of like you're both the conductor and the composer. And so maybe in the short term you're the conductor, long term you'll be the composer, where you kind of like know that this is what you want it to sound like. You don't exactly know the details of what instrument to play when and where. So you're going to be experimenting using the AI as like a sounding board. It's like, maybe the first 10 attempts by it will be bad, but you know enough about quality and taste to be like, okay, this is a good solution, this is bad, this can be tweaked this way, and so on. So it goes back to like the various essays you often see, especially in product management, on having the core skills is important, but you used to be like, how do you develop good taste, good product sense? How can you spot a good product from a bad product? And those are the things that often takes like years of experience. To explain
Yes,
what you mentioned though, you're short circuiting all that. Basically there will be no intermediate steps. You're going to start day one being like, okay, let me go write a spec on like changing this icon color from something to another. That's going to be automated away. It's going to be more of like, okay, why is there an icon even there? What should the icon do? We need what is the
exactly.
better way of conveying this information? You're moving up a level, and that
Yes,
gets
yes,
that is good territories for a lot of us who've been PMs for a long time. But for entry level PMs who never saw this before, it's going to be scary. And I agree, it's going to be a tectonic shift. And I don't know if the world or even the education system or even the onboarding plans is preparing people to be successful
for
in that
sure.
area.
100%. And I think the important part here, that's actually part of the reason why I don't buy into the idea that like there's going to be this job called a prompt engineer. Because in my mind, again, caveat, personal opinion, that's a dumb job. From why? Because you can be just a prompt engineer. You have to understand what exactly you're prompting and getting out of it. If I am writing SQL queries and I have no idea if the output is correct or not, I have no clue how it actually works behind the scenes, I can introduce so many problematic things into the fold, into my product, into whatever I'm building, because like I have no idea what I'm doing. I asked them to give me the query. I pasted the query. I copy pasted. There you go. Like, no, I still need to validate the data. I still need to. So that's why I really like the framing. And I think not to like necessarily like call out like specific companies, but like the framing of this being a co-pilot to you as a developer, as a designer, as somebody is genius in my mind, because it's like it's somebody that assists you. It doesn't necessarily take over 100% of what you're doing, but it can help you do what you're already doing. If you are a doctor that goes and says like I need to analyze these 17 x-rays, wouldn't it be awesome for an AI to look at that and be like, hey, like these are the anomalies that I see. And then you as a doctor, you're not abdicating your responsibility, right? You're not like, oh, AI said here, I'm going to go to tell patients. No, you're not. You're absolutely not. You're still going to look, you're going to validate that and say like, okay, this warrants like another test. This warrants me to go and re-image. Same thing goes for developers. Same thing goes for designers. Same thing goes for product managers. The abdication of responsibility is just not something that I see happening, purely because somebody needs to make sure that whatever the output is actually the output. Just because you could type in some text and you generate an image, like, hey, look at me, I'm a prompt engineer now. Look how awesome! Like I designed this thing, right? I produced this art. Like, no, you didn't. And here's the thing, like if you have like Kiruba, like you mentioned, like if you don't have the sense of like what is good art, how should a page be laid out? What are the proportions? What's the good color scheme? You have to have that sense, right? Like you can't just toss things over the wall and be like, well, the AI told me that my page should be yellow with these blue buttons, so that's what I'm going to do. Like, nah.
I hear you, Dan. Now, I know when we started this conversation, and one thing they reached out to you and they wanted to chat was like, I want to
Mm-hmm.
know more about your Halo integrations and things like that. I think we probably covered a lot more interesting topics than we could get to in that time frame. I think we should probably have you on in the future at some point to talk
Sure.
both about this as well as that. But before though, I do want to have the Halo part, covered
Sure.
because it was one of the formative games for me. Like when I first played
Yeah.
Halo on the PC, that was an eye-opening experience because I played
Mm-hmm.
Half-Life. Like, yeah, Half-Life. All these games are cool. But Halo was the first time I was like, wait a minute, this is absolutely amazing. Like the
Yeah.
beat scene with the warthog and like the wheel is now going on of its own because it got destroyed. Like those were just like mind blowing moments for me. So, what's your favorite Halo game?
Man, I'm also going to go against the grain here and say that I actually like Halo 4.
Halo Four,
Like
yes.
people bag on me for this all the time because like Halo 4 is when 343 took over from Bungie and they totally butchered it. No, they didn't. I like the Forerunner story. I like the Didact. I like the Promethean weapons that they introduced. There's a whole bunch of really cool stuff that they added that I think set the franchise in the right direction. So I think Halo 4 has been my favorite. Like I started my Halo career with Halo 3, but when I saw 4, I was like, this is like levels better than what I played in 3. And then with like the multiplayer in 4 was great, and just the dynamics of that game and just the visuals, hands down. I still like I'm in the middle right now of replaying the campaign again in MCC because I played kind of the original Halo 4, but now I have it's not remaster, it's just integrated in the Master Chief Collection. But that's my current pastime. It's just going through the campaign once again after what it's been like 10 years, something like that.
Yeah, it really has. I remember like buying it on the day of. At Microsoft you get the
Mhm.
discount as well at the time. So it was like on day one I was like, I'm gonna getting it when I play it and so on. So what is your take on Halo ODST? Or do you ever play Halo ODST?
Yes, Halo 3 ODST was, I think, an interesting spin, and I actually wish we had more of them. Because you take it a different perspective, and it'd be kind of cool to see a Halo from the perspective of, let's say, the Covenant or maybe the Forerunners. Like, the Halo universe is just so rich in all these different stories and like the lore behind it. Like, I'm a nerd, I'll admit it right now, that like I read the Halo books. Like, I have a giant shelf behind me to just stacked with like top to bottom with just Halo books. And I wish we had more of a perspective on that. So ODST was actually, in my mind, really good because you see somebody that's not necessarily the core protagonist, like the Master Chief, the Spartans. You see,
You're
like,
not a Spartan. You're just a normal human being.
yes, exactly. Like, you're
You
a
can't
normal
dual wield.
human. You're a soldier, and you go through the motions of what you see happening, right? And I think that was a great experience. And again, the visual, like the atmosphere, the kind of the meme of like the saxophone starts playing as you start like walking around, like it was great. I loved it, and maybe I'm just a very easy to please fan because I played through all the games, and they all sound really cool to me, and they all look really cool to me. And like Halo Infinite, the story, I think the spoiler alert, the reveal of the Endless at the end that opens up new doors for probably future campaigns, maybe, like, I'm excited about that. That sounds great. I don't know, man. It's just, I feel like there's just so much in the universe to still explore.
Very, very last question. Halo
Yeah.
Wars. What's your take on that?
Haven't played beyond like one or two games.
Okay.
I look, real-time strategy is my thing. I play Age of Empires a lot, and somehow Halo Wars just never really clicked with me. But you know what? I'm gonna try it again. Maybe
Try
like
it again
my,
because
yeah.
I was in the same. I played Warcraft 3
Yeah.
and like Starcraft
Mhm.
and Age of Empires and all. I loved like that game. I was like, how can a controller and a console be able to allow
Yeah.
me to do all these things? They had really interesting ways of doing it, and it actually
Mhm.
was like I think for probably a year or two, it was like all of my people in the team I worked at Microsoft, we
Mhm.
all would get in the evenings and play Halo Wars together. It was like
Oh
it
man.
was actually the thing that we did. Actually, it was actually like a lot of fun. So
I need to try
definitely
it
give it a
again.
shot. At some point.
I see, like, the beauty of this podcast is after this I'm just like, man, now I want to try Halo Wars because Kirupa recommended it, and this is like, your seal of approval to it. Oh, hold on. I lost your video for. Oh, you're
Yeah,
back now.
now you're back. Now you're back.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, it was fantastic chatting with you. I think we covered a lot of really fun topics on product management, which actually is
On
great because
everything.
for the most part, though, right? You don't get to chat with that many people who've been a product manager in a dev technical space for as long as you have, and so it's just great catching up on all of that. And we talked about Halo at the end as well, so I think that more than
Totally.
made up for like my curiosity on like Halo in general. So it all worked out.
That was a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me here.